Take it away.
Thank you all so much for giving us some time to come here and share with you some of our findings from our time spent in this district carrying out the social worlds and youth well-being study. So I know we delivered a pretty massive report. Hopefully the executive summary was a good guide and overview, and then you can kind of use that to delve deeper. Obviously, we're not going to be able to go through absolutely every single thing in the report today, but we're going to give you a good overview of some take-home points and things to think about, and then hopefully have a bit of a conversation. We do want to acknowledge we have a wonderful co-investigator. She's on day 2 back from maternity leave, so she's not here with us today, but she's definitely played a major role in rolling all of this out, as well as our incredible research team, who also were critical to getting this done. So I want to just revisit some of the initial goals that we had with this study from the very beginning. This study began actually in 2018. We began talking with Dr. Serco because we discovered we had this shared interest in figuring out better ways to do suicide prevention in schools. And one of the things that we believed as sociologists of education, as well as sociologists of youth suicide, we've dedicated the past 12 years to working with schools to figure out ways to better support kids, to prevent suicide, and also to take care of kids after suicide losses have happened in our schools. And we really felt like it was important to come into schools and actually have an opportunity to learn from school staff about how they do this work. And of course, at the same time, we wanted to be able to give back and to help identify things that impede or enhance the suicide prevention strategies that schools use. And then ultimately, we want to leverage this knowledge to help develop sustainable, effective, and equitable suicide prevention strategies that schools across the United States can use. So those were shared goals. And one of the really important reasons, of course, for thinking about youth suicide is that unfortunately, particularly since 2007, we've just seen dramatic increases across the United States in youth suicide. Among certain subpopulations, so this is a table from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention showing the suicide rate among people ages 15 to 19. I don't have this broken down by gender, but I can tell you that for girls ages 15 to 19, the suicide rates over this period have reached unprecedented rates that we haven't seen in over 40 years. So this is really a unique period in our society. For our kids, our little guys, ages 10 to 14, the suicide rate has increased to a rate we've never seen before, and it's actually been declared a national crisis, and there's been this huge effort to begin improving suicide prevention in our middle schools and even our elementary schools, because unfortunately we see suicides happening at earlier and earlier ages. Of course, this is also a local problem, right? Mesa County, one of the reasons that Dr. Serco reached out to us and asked if we could collaborate on this project was because Mesa County has had some really difficult years and is more impacted by suicide than other places in Colorado and the United States. Additionally, the youth and young adults in Mesa County are disproportionately impacted by suicide and suicidality. So this is from the Mesa County Suicide Report from the Department of Public Health, 2022. And you can see on the left here that our youth and young adults are the largest group who are showing up in our emergency departments for suicidality, and they're also the ones who have the highest rates of suicide attempts and ideations. And this is local data. So one of the things that's broadly understood in suicide prevention is that schools are one of the most important places where we have opportunities to prevent suicide. But what is less known is that we actually have very few evidence-based strategies for schools to use to prevent suicide that schools can actually sustain over the long run. A lot of our strategies were actually developed in clinical settings and then just kind of put into a school without any consideration of all of the other things that schools have on their plate or that school staff have to accomplish. And so that is one of the reasons we formed this collaboration with D51 and developed this project to figure out ways that we can do better to serve kids and families. We're really grateful to our funders, especially the Western Colorado Community Foundation, which gave us our seed money, our initial $80,000, which we were able to use to collect initial data so that we could prove to the National Institute of Mental Health that this was actually a really important project that would be worthwhile. And then we had the National Institute of Mental Health invest $2 million that is what resulted in this mammoth project and report for you all. We spent all of that money here in the Grand Valley. I'm not going to go over our methods in any great detail, although I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. But one of the main things we did was participant observations. So we shadowed school staff and we learned about how they worked on a daily basis. We learned how they innovated, how they got creative, the things they did to support kids, broadly speaking, as well as in moments of crisis. So we ended up shadowing 271 school staff members. We also did interviews with a broad swath of individuals, with students, obviously with parental consent, with young adults who had recently graduated from the school district, with our families, with our school and district staff, as well as some community professionals, often the mental health workers in the Grand Valley. We also had an opportunity to do 2 surveys, both a family survey where we were able to collect the insights from over 700 family members with children attending D51 middle and high schools, as well as school and district staff from 2 middle schools and then all of the high schools. The support that we had from the district as well as from the school leadership was incredible, and we ended up with a 75% response rate on our staff survey. And just for context, in order for that survey to be able to produce like robust insights and represent what how staff feel and their experiences, we needed to cross the threshold of 30%, and we hit 75. So that's really amazing. So now I'm going to turn to sort of sharing out some of these highlights. I'm going to begin with youth voices because they're really at the center of this, right? So kids really want us to listen to them, to give them chances for leadership, to participate in developing our mental health promotion strategies and identifying ways that we can improve their lives and their well-being. Some of the things that they are very quick to remind us of is that they're growing up in a world that looks really different from our own, and they really want a seat at the table when it comes to these really important issues that a lot of kids really care about. Kids also, they don't want to be judged, and they definitely don't want to be labeled or perceived as a bad kid, even when they sometimes do things that are perhaps not what the adults in their lives wish they would engage in. Part of this is that they really care what their school staff members think about them, and so those they want a second chance, and they want to feel like they belong at school and like they matter to school staff. They also want stuff to do. This is more of a problem on the eastern side of the valley, as opposed to the west, where I think the west has a great rec center that is just a really positive place for kids to go and hang out and spend time together. We're also going to be sharing this information with community leaders, so like that's maybe perhaps less on the school district, but we're also just faithfully reporting what kids said. So when it comes to understanding the role of schools in suicide prevention, our data was incredibly clear. The bottom line, according to both families as well as school staff, is that suicide prevention is very much seen as part of the job of schools and the work that we need school staff to be doing. So just to show you, I promise this is the most you're going to see on one slide, but it's really important to kind of look at it all together. So these are a series of survey items that we asked families. We also asked school staff these exact same questions, and their answers looked almost similar to this. It's just that more school staff strongly agreed than families. But what you can see here is that across the board, the vast majority of families, over 80%, across the board, strongly agree that schools should train staff members to recognize warning signs of suicide, should help connect families to community support services, educate students about warning signs of suicide, have mental health staff that can talk with suicidal students to determine next steps, be able to advise parents and guardians about how to support their suicidal child. And then the only item that had a little less support although it was still a majority, is this last item, that schools should provide support to suicidal students during the school day. There is sometimes some stigma around suicide, and we sometimes, both school staff as well as families kind of want to be like, no, I don't want my kid exposed to someone who's suicidal. However, it's actually the law that unless a kid is in a suicidal crisis and they need something like a crisis care or hospitalization, we do need to find ways to serve them in school buildings and especially provide support that enables them to get back to their class and have those opportunities to learn. So this is a pretty broad endorsement of things that families as well as school staff feel that schools should be able to do. There are, of course, some challenges to schools prioritizing suicide prevention. Sometimes finding that right balance between academics versus the social emotional side of schools can be tricky on both sides, right? Sometimes the academics dominate, and other times kids' needs for social emotional support are so intense that it can be hard to find ways to get them back into class. So this can be tricky. I think it's particularly tricky in the context of resource scarcity, particularly with regard to not being able to fill all mental health staff positions. And that's just unfortunately a reality that we see in schools here in the Grand Valley, but also in other parts of the country. This last point is also really important. We had a good subset of families that basically do recognize that we're asking so much of schools, and that they really wish a different social institution like healthcare or mental health care or our faith communities could pick up the slack and give schools a break. And I appreciate that, but I actually would prefer that they were like, wow, schools are really overburdened. We need to give them more resources so that they're not so overburdened. And that's simply because there's no way that schools can get out of doing this work, because kids spend the majority of their waking hours in school buildings. Every kid has access to a public school, and that just means that this is the best place for us to lay eyes on kids on a regular basis, to get to know them and have this opportunity to see when they're suffering and connect them to care. Of course, sometimes we're going to be connecting them to care that's in the community rather than within the school building. So there is absolutely a role for all of those other critical organizations in our communities. So one of the reasons that I feel so strongly about that is just when we look at the prevalence of suicide prevention that is just actually happening in schools, it becomes abundantly clear that we have to have ways and mechanisms to do this work and do it well. So we asked a series of questions that have to do with how often school staff are engaged in different forms of suicide prevention work or work to support students' mental health. So we asked questions like, how often do you talk to a student about their mental health? How often do you tell a counselor, I'm concerned about a student? How often do you send a student to the counselor? And also things like, how often do you ask a student if they're thinking about suicide? Let's start with the teachers, which is the third bar down in this figure. And what I want you to see here is that over 50% of our teachers are actually asking this question of a student at least once a year. That's a lot of teachers engaging in this work. And on the one hand, that's really beautiful. I appreciate how much teachers care about their students and how far they're willing to go to support them. But that's a lot of work that they're having to do. Administrators are also heavily involved in suicide prevention. We had 4% of administrators say they do this weekly, 44% do it monthly. So the majority of administrators are having to engage in this work regularly. Of course, our mental health staff are the ones who do this the most often. Almost 11% do it daily, 24% do it weekly, 40% do it monthly. You can just see how often our school staff are having to actually talk to students about suicide. Now, you may notice it's very interesting. We'll give our administrators a shout out. This doesn't surprise me, but there was not a single administrator who said that they never asked this question in a given year. That's really the administrators, the school leadership in these buildings are so passionate about their kids and very passionate about suicide prevention and meeting kids where they are, even if that is with this very difficult topic of suicide. There is 16% of our mental health staff who actually report never asking students this question. The majority of them are actually nurses and nurses' aides, and when we did interviews with nurses, that is a part of their professional capacities, is to have these conversations with kids, to do suicide screeners. They need the training just like school counselors and school psychologists, but they actually kind of want to be put in the game a little bit more. So that's actually a resource we already have in school buildings, that if we shifted the strategies that we use, we could be more inclusive in them. Sometimes if a kid starts a conversation about suicide with a nurse, they actually have to at some point take them over to the counselor to do the suicide screener. And that's just a little unfortunate given their professional capacities. We also wanted to, when we figured out that a student is actually potentially thinking about suicide, we then have to advance to doing a suicide risk review. So we asked our mental health staff members how often they're screening students for suicide risk. And you can see that 18% of our mental health staff, which I should have said this, I apologize, it does include our nurses, nurses aides, school psychologists, school counselors, and school social workers, and mental health therapists that are in the building. So 18% do this weekly, over 50% do it monthly. So we're actually having to screen kids in every building with quite a bit of frequency. We explored a lot of demographic differences. We wondered whether people who were older, who are more experienced in their careers, whether people of different race, ethnicities, or I always blank on this, different political orientations, whether conservatives, moderates, or liberals, as well as people from different faith backgrounds engage in this work at different rates, and we found no significant differences. Basically, everybody, almost like regardless of who they are, what kind of person, how they identify, they're all engaging in this work on behalf of our students. And that was actually really across the board. We see these are broadly shared values in our school system. The one difference we did find was by gender. And we do find that women in our school buildings are doing this mental health work, the suicide prevention work, a little more often than men. That said, I want to be very clear that the majority of men in our school buildings are doing this at least like monthly, if not more often. So that's not nothing, right? That's quite a lot of support that's happening. And it certainly can be incredibly powerful when our coaches, our men teachers, or our men counselors do this work on behalf of students. So of course, we're really interested in what facilitates staff engaging in suicide prevention work, broadly defined. And when I say suicide prevention work, I include everything under that umbrella, checking in with a kid about their mental health, all the way up to actually having to do a suicide screener, although only certain kinds of staff do suicide screeners. So when we look at that body of work, one of the things that stands out as being so important to enabling staff to do this work more often is having a clear understanding that this is their job, that this is expected of them. Additionally, I'm always interested in the impact of high-quality suicide prevention training. We found that it has an effect at the margins for teachers, meaning that it encourages teachers who would otherwise never do this work to do it once a year, but it does not have an impact on teachers who are doing this work monthly. It doesn't make them do it, every week. We also found that staff who felt more comfortable and more knowledgeable about mental health topics, and that's not just about suicide, but also things about trauma and how that impacts children and the brain and so on and so forth, that actually enables staff to engage in this work. We also asked some questions about what might stop staff from asking an extremely distressed student that they encounter in their school building, asking them the question, are you thinking of killing yourself? And one of the beautiful and powerful things that we found is that the most common response was that nothing would stop them. And in fact, actually often staff would actually write in under other barrier, nothing would stop me, which is wonderful. But that said, we did find some other barriers, and in particular, concerns about legal liability was at the top of the list as the second most frequent response. And this is going to be a bit of a theme throughout the rest of our presentation that we'll return to. The second set of factors all have to do with knowledge gaps being a barrier. Either not having enough knowledge about suicide or mental health, or not being comfortable with the topic, but also things like believing that not all extremely distressed kids are suicidal. And here's the thing, that's absolutely true. Not all extremely distressed kids are suicidal. But unfortunately, suicidal kids don't wear a sign on their forehead that says I'm suicidal. So if we see someone who is in extreme distress, we need to begin asking those questions and figuring out exactly where their distress lies and whether we need to, activate other resources. So I don't want that to be a barrier to asking this question. The last one in this box, I would be afraid that asking increases the likelihood of a suicide attempt. So this is actually a myth. This is actually incorrect. But we had 17% of our staff members say that this is a concern that they have. This is a broadly held concern in American society. They're not alone in this. But we do need to address it because actually asking this question, research has shown it's safe to ask this question, and it actually increases the safety of that child, in part because it starts a conversation that can allow us to connect kids to care. Now, if we're asking a lot of our school staff, as doing this work is not always easy, and I say that as someone who is also a teacher and who has had to talk to her own students about suicide when I really wanted to talk to them about statistics or whatever class I was teaching at the time, I want to acknowledge that doing this work can be very difficult. And in fact, among teachers, but not among the mental health staff, we did find that on average, teachers who do more suicide prevention work and do more work to support student mental health, they do report higher levels of what's called secondary trauma. And we used a measure of secondary trauma that's specific to school students and school staff. And it looks at things like, are you ruminating about the work you did in the school that day? Could you not sleep? Were you having heart palpitations? Were you terribly worried? And et cetera. So I do want to stress that this is an important thing for us to keep in mind and to find ways to better support staff through this work. Our research at this time could not establish a cause and effect relationship. We did not ask teachers about what else might be going on in their lives that could be causing stress or trauma. So this is not a cause and effect, but it is certainly an association we need to keep in mind. There were other factors that increased the secondary trauma levels in teachers. Worrying about legal liability, again, is a big stressor, as are work-life balance issues. Interestingly, having negative attitudes towards mental health work, like believing that it shouldn't be their job to support students' mental health, was actually also associated with higher levels of secondary trauma. Thankfully, there were some things that decreased secondary trauma. One of the big ones was actually having faith that district protocols not only would protect staff from legal liability, but that they would actually also support kids. Both of those things actually decrease secondary trauma in teachers. So there are some things that we can do. Additionally, having mental health relevant knowledge and having social support at work, like people that you can turn to for information and emotional support, is really important. All right, so I get to turn it over to Seth now.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'll try to lean into it. Oh, that makes me feel a little bit weird, like I'm on a talk show. So we have a broad mandate in the community to be doing this work, and regardless of the mandate, this work is being done in the schools. So the question that we have to ask is, how do we do it effectively? And some of the strategies that I'm going to talk about, we observed in the schools. Some were being done already, being done well. Some areas of growth need to be produced there. But we've also observed strategies in the Front Range and in other places. And there's other people doing research like this. And so a lot of this is a culmination of all that research. The foundation for doing good suicide begins with the whole child educational suicide prevention, begins with the whole child educational philosophy. This is something that's already here. So the foundation is already built. The district has adopted this philosophy. All the schools we observed have adopted this philosophy. It just starts with the idea that kids are not just students, but whole humans. They have outside lives, they have emotional distress, home trauma, all sorts of pieces that make them individual, and therefore individual care plans are sometimes necessary. The second piece is a culture of belonging. Again, this is something we observed. It's in every school. All of the administrators, the district, staff, they're all committed to this. I was here in 3 of the high schools in 2021 at the beginning of the year, and again in 2022 at the beginning of the year, when the administrators were having their conversations about the goals for the year. Connectivity, trusted adults. How do we bring kids in who ordinarily are on the outside, on the margins? How do we make sure that they're in here? And what we have found is that when you create these cultures of belonging, when you adopt these whole child educational philosophies, it increases the child's willingness to seek help, which is really what we want. We want them to be able to tell an adult, I need help, because it's hard sometimes to catch the kids who are hiding it really, really well. Now you may be asking yourselves, why haven't I actually talked about suicide yet? And in part because when we think about suicide prevention, I think we often think about the kid in crisis, the kid who really needs processed right immediately, maybe sent to a crisis center, maybe reached out to the parents immediately, these strong signals. But what we're interested in is building systems in schools that catch the weak signals before they become strong signals. So suicide prevention is not just about catching the serious suicide, but doing the work that teachers are doing now, but becoming more intentional about it. Saying thank you to a student, saying that student brightens their day. Kid struggles in math, does really well on a quiz, rewarding them with some sort of special things in the classroom to do, right? Just these little things that they're probably doing, but just thinking, oh, I am doing suicide prevention. How can I add to this? How can I expand this? How can I do it deliberately? Some issues that we saw in interviews, in observations, these are probably not surprising things. There are always places where we can improve upon. For instance, there's always kids who are not the ideal students. There are kids who struggle with academics. They're not the most athletic kids. They're not the most popular kids. And finding ways to continue to be intentional about how we include them is really important. So, for instance, I've observed all sorts of clubs that are created in schools that are designed specifically just to have those kids. Dungeons and Dragons, so the kid doesn't want to do this. They want to do something with the fantasy role play, right? So those things are great. Or in the Valley, there's lots of kids who have suffered all sorts of trauma, poverty, food insecurity, home trauma, and just continuing to be very intentional about how do we do this, right? Making sure that teachers have the trauma response training so they're not apprehensive or uncomfortable with noticing a kid that's in distress, maybe not stopping the lecture, but just letting them know, I see you. After class, I'll talk to you, and then knowing where to take that kid if the distress is really serious. Of course, philosophies and culture is very important, but we are really interested in system building. Obviously, systems are great because they endure. Principals retire, they move schools, counselors retire, they move schools, staff retire. Systems, though, outlast those individuals, and people can come in and there's something there for them to take over right away. What we have seen both in the Front Range and here, and what we believe is the best system to harness because it's already there, it doesn't have to be rebuilt, is the multi-tiered support systems that are there, the MTSS. We think that they can be really, really effective. What we noticed in the Valley is there's tremendous variation in how they're implemented, ranging from highly formal and systematic to virtually invisible. And the problem with this sort of variation is that a lot of staff we spoke with didn't know what the MTS did, where it met, when it met, whether it was valuable or not. Could they send a kid there for this or that? If they sent the kid there, what happens? Would they find out that something was actually done for that child? And so we're really pushing leadership to buy into the MTS, to think about how to formalize and standardize it, to make it visible, and to make it very predictable and consistent in how it identifies distress signals, processes those distress signals, and then triages the distress signals, whatever those distress signals might be. In addition to that, we recommend using a system that has academic behavioral engagement as well as mental health and social-emotional challenges. That is integrating the whole child into it. Usually these things are designed just for academics and behavior, but obviously, as we know, sometimes a kid is getting Fs, but it's not just fixing those Fs that's gonna fix the child, but getting at the root causes, the things that are maybe underlying and persistent that will help that child succeed academically and also as a human. Including more staff in the process, really, really important. Clear referral processes, really important. And again, improving strategies to prevent information loss. And by this, all we mean is finding those weak signals and not letting those weak signals disappear, right? But rather 3 or 4 weak signals here and there gathered into one centralized place becomes a strong signal that the school can then act upon. And maybe we don't ever get to that crisis stage where the school is really stressed out. In addition, we noticed that there are communication barriers that are worth noting and just, again, being deliberate and intentional about. All the schools know about these things. For instance, we talked to a mother, Juanita, who told us that she had called a school about her son. She needed to pick him up because he had several appointments. When she called, the person who answered, she said Spanish to them. They sent her to the line that goes to the fluent Spanish speaker, but no one was there. Went to the answer machine. She hung up. And then she told us, after that, what if there was a crisis in the family? What if I needed an immediate response to this? Now, there's no blame on the person who wasn't there. They may have been going to the bathroom. They may have been having a conversation with somebody else. They may have been translating for somebody else. But the point is schools need to have more resources when it comes to this, because this is about belongingness too, right? This is about building trust between families and the school. So the families will come to the school because they know the school actually will try to overcome this barrier no matter how complicated it might be. And just as a, in the report, you could see over 45% of mental health staff doubt that their personal ability to support the mental health of Spanish-speaking students. Several folks we spoke to told us that sometimes there was a shortage of somebody that could speak fluently, and the child would then have to do the translation, which you can imagine is neither ideal and in some cases not appropriate or potentially harmful to the child. And again, we're all about just building systems, building trust, thickening that safety net so that kids are not dropping and falling through it. The district's role, we have several things in there. I'm only going to pull out a little tiny bit to bring back this idea of legal liability. 77% of classroom staff, these are teachers, paraprofessionals, and anybody who's actually in the classrooms. 77% agree that the district protocols for supporting suicidal students protect them from legal liability. This is a great number because that's actually the truth. Following protocols does lead to legal protection. And the problem, though, is that there's this dark blue on the right-hand side. Over 20% actually do not agree with this. So this is an opportunity here to work with mistrust that might exist between the school staff and the district. The protocols in the past weren't evidence-based, and people might worry that they haven't changed enough. They might not know, right? They might not actually have the understanding that this is what to do, and they might want to just pretend, right? Sweep this under the rug, plausible deniability. But that opens them up to liability. So again, this is a really important piece to suicide prevention, is getting those 30 or 23% on board. Additional district levels, the forms that we use have to be evidence-based. This will also help protect against legal liability. Anna and Jen Daniels have been working on this, and so they're getting closer to the place where we need to be. Clarifying expectations for staff is really, really important. Everyone has to be involved in this. They already are doing the work, right? But what we need is to explain to the non-mental health staff what they are doing that's suicide prevention and what they don't have to do. Secretaries and teachers don't have to be heroes. They just have to be trusted adults, friendly human beings, care. The mental health staff have to be the ones that are prepared to give this evidence-based suicide risk reviews, to get that training and to renew that training, to be able to talk to parents and guardians about what the next steps are and to involve the families in appropriate ways.
So we're big believers. I mean, schools are a part of a broader community, right? And they cannot do this work alone. That's incredibly essential. Even though they're so critical to it, we also need to look beyond the school district. So one of the things that we noted, and again, as I said, we'll be taking this to community leaders as well, was that there's limited activities and there's a need for transportation in order to support sort of positive youth development across the Grand Valley. It's also really important to improve access to mental health crisis care. I'm actually extraordinarily excited that since writing this, I found out that there's a new psychiatric ER in town, which is like phenomenal. I mean, that alone, honestly, brings down my blood pressure a bit. That's just such amazing news. But we also, mental health care, we never have enough of it. We always need more. And it is critical, of course, to suicide prevention. There is a suicide hotspot in the Grand Valley, and we are doing work directly with that organization to address that to the best of our abilities as well. But it's actually best if we keep that work a bit private so that we don't undermine the efficacy. Additionally, one of the things we did find is that there is quite a bit of mental health stigma in the Grand Valley that can make it a little bit difficult sometimes to ask for help. So we found that good proportions of our families and our school staff acknowledge that there are adults who feel afraid to tell others about their mental health issues or who feel embarrassed about having mental health issues, even though this is just unfortunately a part of the human condition. I say unfortunately because I really hate when I don't feel well or when I feel depressed or anxious. It's very unpleasant, right? But there are just sometimes challenging times that hit us, and so it's helpful if we can just kind of think of this as part of just the human condition. We also found that faith communities across the Grand Valley are incredibly important to people's both well-being as well as to help seeking when they are when they are having those difficult times. I think this is a beautiful quote from Parent that captures the sentiment that we heard from numerous family members as well as school staff members. You know, it's such a wonderful thing to realize how much God loves me and that He wants me to be healthy. So that helps me want to pursue therapy because I want to be my best self, and so on and so forth. We actually found that almost 20% of families who had actually experienced a mental health crisis with one of their children had turned to their religious leader for help. So these are very much people who sometimes get called on to do this kind of ministry. And of those people who turned to their faith leader, 60% rated that person as very helpful, and no one rated them as not at all helpful. It's also, so this is kind of a call to action, right? And there are trainings that exist. In fact, Jen Daniels is just a jack of all trades, and she can do soul shop. And so we just really encourage our faith leaders to just recognize this critical role that they are playing and to make sure that they're ready and able to help families and kids through these sometimes difficult times. And these are just 2 trainings that are evidence-based and endorsed by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and that directly are targeting faith communities. So I'm going to turn now to just talking about some initial recommendations. I will share that, you know, we see this as a conversation. We are not the kind of people who come in with outside recommendations and just like, you know, I think that, you know, this is how we work. School staff and school leaders and you all as the people who are here every single day, you all need to also help us think creatively about how we can use these knowledge and turn them into solutions, both that support our staff as they do this sometimes difficult work, as well as, of course, supporting our children in the Grand Valley. So these are some initial recommendations. Of course, you know, so one of the things that I love to point out is that school funding is actually a fundamental form of suicide prevention. Schools need resources, and there's no way to do this work well if we don't have sufficient mental health staff in our school buildings. It's important to pay attention to the needs of different schools. You all collect amazing data on what's happening in your school buildings, so you can assess need and then send more resources to, and just make sure that those resources are being maximized and that they're reaching the kids that need it most. We have been talking all day, so I'm sorry. I'm starting to trip over my own tongue. I think it's also, you know, we've said this several times, but I'll just, you know, say it one more time, that I think we need to reframe what suicide prevention is. Suicide prevention can feel really big and scary, but it's so much more than handling kids in crisis. And actually the schools here, they do a really great job of supporting kids who've been identified as suicidal. Connecting them to care, working with families to make sure that that care is targeted to that family and that child's needs. But it's also about these broader things we've been talking about we call this upstream suicide prevention. And basically because it is so difficult to identify someone when they're at that moment in crisis, there's been this push within suicide prevention to move upstream and just start thinking about how do we build relationships that make it easier for kids to seek help from us? How do we just build worlds that make it easier for kids to be happy and healthy? How do we make kids feel cared about, seen, and heard? And the beautiful thing about this is that this helps every single person think creatively about what they can do in their school building with their kids in their classrooms or in their offices. We do need to clarify expectations with staff with regard to suicide prevention. Seth kind of already went over that really clearly, but this is really important, both to make it very clear what we are asking, but what we're not asking. Again, to protect some staff's well-being and enable them to do this work. Oh, and you know what? I'm sorry I didn't say this earlier, but I meant to also say that while doing suicide prevention work is associated with an increase in secondary trauma among our teachers, it is not associated with secondary trauma among our mental health workers. So that also shows us that with some education and training, we may be able to do a better job of helping teachers navigate and understand how to do that work in a way that's emotionally safe for them. Of course, the district is already working on this, and Jen Daniels is like a national treasure that you all have here. But they should obviously work to ensure that all suicide prevention and postvention protocols are evidence-based, that they're up to date, and that they're consistent with best practices. That helps us address those concerns around legal liability, which can impact staff well-being as well as their willingness to engage in this work. And I'll tell you, it's actually pretty simple, and there's some great resources, but basically documenting what you've done, what you learned, and communicating it to parents. That's how you protect a school. A school that has done that has never lost a lawsuit when it comes to suicide prevention. And these are just two resources that spell that out in much more detail. It's also really important to make sure that staff are trained in mental health and suicide prevention. So one of the things that is not always known is that even the most advanced adolescent psychiatrists or clinical psychologists, like these people with PhDs or MDs, they actually do not necessarily have any training in suicide prevention. And that needs to change, obviously. But that's the reality that we're working with today. And that is also true of our school counselors, our school psychologists, and social workers. Sometimes they've had this training, they got lucky, sometimes they pursued it on their own. But because we cannot assume that they have it, it's really essential for the school district to make sure that all mental health staff are assist trained. And assist training is it's basically the best evidence-based training that we have. It's also, at this point, kind of the only training we have that's appropriate for mental health workers, specifically about suicide prevention. But it has shown that it has strategies that are embedded within it that actually help people in the course of one conversation, help people heal, help people feel better. So it's a very powerful training. And guess what? Jen Daniels is a trainer. So you guys are lucky. So she trained me, actually. That was the first time I got to do an assist training, was with Jen. Because we don't have it in Indiana. It's coming, but it's harder to access. So, and then finally, we need to talk and we need to think about staff well-being. Our staff are doing so much for us as a society, for you all as a community, that we need to always be thinking about ways that we can help teachers and school staff promote take care of their own well-being. And of course, these supportive relationships are so powerful. It's already happening in a lot of schools. And so that's just a really nice leverage to think about how can we facilitate social connections that can help avoid that secondary trauma from sometimes difficult work days that happen. So just to recap, our take-home points. First of all, schools do have a broad mandate from families and staff to do mental health promotion and suicide prevention in our schools. Additionally, schools must do this work, so it's really good that you have this broad mandate because emotionally distressed and suicidal kids are at school and they're in need of support. It's important, of course, to then have these systems alongside those cultures of belonging that you guys have already been lifting up for years to make sure that this work is done well and effectively to support our children. Ensuring staff are trained and knowledgeable about mental health as well as trauma. It helps staff's own well-being as well as their ability to help kids. Our school staff work tremendously hard, so we need to always consider their well-being too. And then last but not least, schools cannot do this work alone. They need the support of their broader community, both in terms of critical resources, but also in terms of alternative places for care. There are, of course, going to be moments when we need to turn to our faith communities, when we need to turn to our mental health emergency rooms, crisis centers, because that's the kind of work that schools are never, that's going to be kind of beyond the school's mandate. So we're going to stop there, and we welcome questions, thoughts, concerns, anything, feedback.
Okay. So I wanted to inquire as to where some of your statistics came from.
Sure.
Because when I was reading this earlier today, I started digging into the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and it gets kind of willy-nilly because sometimes it'll let you go all the way back till 2004, and then sometimes the system shuts down and it doesn't want to do anything. But from what I was finding from Mesa County from 2004 to 2022, from the ages of 10 to 14, we had 16 identified suicides, 12 males, 4 females. 15 to 18 was 21, with 17 males and 4 females. And you had made mention that the increase in female victims has risen. Is that from,
That's national data.
so national data? Okay, so that's
the
not
CDC.
necessarily just Mesa County?
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah,
Okay.
those first were national data.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then one of the things that I noticed when I was looking at those statistics from the 2004 to 2020 is that it appears that our highest suicide rate is 35 to 44. And so that would be like a parental area. And just from personal experience, when I was a kid, I had 3 friends that committed suicide, and they had that history in their families. Are we doing any research in our area that shows the correlation from parental suicide to child suicide?
That is such an amazing question and such an important point. So I have done work before, not here in Mesa County, that looks at how parental suicide can impact kids, and it has a terrible impact. And it's also important to realize that. So that is not, I will also say that is not something that we particularly looked at here in the Grand Valley. There's so much to do when it comes to understanding suicide that we always had to kind of, hone in. We also did not do that much work on suicide postvention here specifically, although that is what Seth and I spent the 6 years prior to coming to Colorado, was just focusing on school postvention. And then we decided we wanted to do something a little happier and focus on help seeking and building mental health safety nets in schools so that we can try to get to kids before that. So we do know that there are correlations within families, but it's also not deterministic, right? So it's important for us to always have a bit of hope and realize that just because a family has weathered a tragedy doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen. But it's a very painful experience that basically, changes someone for the rest of their life, just like losing a child to suicide has an incredibly profound impact on a family system as well as a school community. So another reason that I think that really matters is that some of those individuals are going to be, that older age range are going to be people who are impacted by suicide and who are working in our schools, right? And that could contribute to that secondary trauma that we sometimes see in teachers. And Seth and I are already thinking about our next project because it's never enough. We always need to know more. And one of the things we'd like to do, I know we're also a little bit tired, but that's okay. We have a lot of writing to do. But we really care about kids and communities and doing a better job for them. And one of the things we would like to do is actually to collect longitudinal survey data so that we could begin to understand some of the complexities in these relationships and begin to suss out cause and effect and what are some of those broader things that are happening in people's lives that makes it tough. But thank you for bringing that up, because it's so important to consider how loss impacts families, kids, and our broader community.
So one other thing I wanted to bring up was that there was a comment in here about lack of transportation for kids for certain. So just to kind of give an idea, we do have the Grand Valley transportation system, and parents can get into that. It's in Spanish, it's in English. They can fill out a form, and as long as they have their student ID, then students can use that along with a pass, and then they can receive transportation throughout the city. Really? So that is a really good program that we have here in the Grand Valley for our students. And it's for all students, as long as parents are comfortable with them traveling by themselves and they have that student ID, then they can access that program.
Sometimes it's just about making sure that communities know about some of the resources that are here. And honestly, I love it when that's the solution, right? It's just sharing out information. That's fantastic. So thank you.
So were there, sorry, I have a lot of questions. Was there also any correlation in this as far as how social media is affecting our children?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so social media is a complex beast. We did not do any work here on social media, but I can tell you about the broader literature and folks who are working in that. So there is, for some kids, there's a very harmful relationship between social media and their mental health. There's a variety of things that can go terribly wrong when kids are on social media, especially like completely unsupervised or where families are not talking to them about being critical consumers. One of the things that can happen is that can really amplify social comparisons and distress related to comparing yourself to these like picture perfect images that people present on social media that are often with filters or so on and so forth. So that's one way that social media can be harmful. It also can be sometimes hard to see people doing all the things. You never kind of can escape adolescent society, whereas like when we were in high school, like you just went home and no one knew what you were doing, you know? They'd have to call you on the landline, your parents would answer, you know, and just the world is really different. So kids kind of never get a break from that, you know, adolescent culture that's happening in schools unless they deliberately make that choice to step away. That said, there also are some ways that social media is actually helpful. And it really is not all bad or all good. Some kids, especially some kids with disabilities, like autism, can find it easier to make friends online, and they can find communities, whereas in the real world, they may be a little bit alienated and isolated. And so that can be really meaningful for kids. The third thing that can happen that is really not good is that kids can be exposed to content that is just, I don't want to see it, right? Like, and I'm an adult. There's certain things that I just don't think children should see, and they sometimes click on things and they don't understand what they're about to see, and that can cause some like pretty serious distress, right? So, you know, social media is here to stay. Am I completely enthusiastic about it? No. But there are some benefits. There are definitely reasons to be concerned. And actually, we haven't even also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, you know, cell phone use way into the night disrupts sleep, which is actually a very serious risk factor for suicide. So like one of my things that I recommend to like my friends who are parents is just like make sure your child is not bringing their phone to their bedroom. Like get them an old-fashioned alarm clock, because you can't control whether they're, you know, watching something at 2 a.m. and that is just not, we know that looking at screens disrupts our sleep, right? So we need to be really conscientious about things like that too.
I have one more question, and I promise you I'll shut up.
I like engagement. Good.
So just when I was reading through this, something that kind of caught my attention is, and it might just be easier for me to quote it, so it's, while we recognize that confidentiality is not always possible, two key solutions to the problem that our school staff should be clear about what can and cannot be kept confidential before a student shares anything, and obtain permission from the youth before disclosing any information to their parents. So I guess when I think about that, so mind you, I was school security, and, you know, I have kids that come in. And my thought process sometimes when I realize that the parent's not the problem, you know, that these children are experiencing these social and emotional situations that aren't necessarily related to home, a lot of it's school. I guess my question is, how do we vet that? Like, how do we train our teachers? How do we train our staff to vet what that is, and what does that look like? Just from this statement, because, you know, as often as I possibly could, I would involve parents, and there was no like clear and concise guideline for when you cut that off and when you don't cut that off. And so I guess I feel like just with that statement there, like, can you provide clarity to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and let me be clear that, I mean, it's often very important to involve parents. Like, that's part of school's responsibility. So, like, we're definitely not advocating to try to avoid that. But if a kid has like a small conflict between peers, it's not necessarily, you know, I mean, it is really difficult, right? So like and when I'm like, you know, I don't like that sentence, actually. I'd like to rewrite that. Because I feel like we've been talking about that like with a little bit more nuance all week. And so the thing, and when we don't ask kids permission to talk to their parents, but we try to involve them in that decision, right? And I'm like, I hope no kids are listening, but it's sort of like if you give kids a set of choices, even if they all involve telling parents, but you're sort of like, okay, you know what? Let's call your parent together. I'd be happy to be the person to talk to your parent, but I really want you to be in the room so you hear what I say and you understand what's happening. But if you want to be the one to call your parent and you talk to your parent and I just sit here and listen, that's okay too. Or if you just want me to call your parent privately, that's also okay. And actually, like kids that we've interviewed, if you do that, they actually feel so empowered and they feel really cared for because the school staff member is like responding to them as an individual with rights, with a right to, to share. But all of those choices involve the fact that we are going to call your parents, right? Where you draw that line about what kinds of things have to be talked about and how do you do that disclosure ahead of time? Like, look, I've in my own, like I'm a professor, I have my own students. Yeah, there's sometimes when a conversation starts slipping and I'm like, ooh, I need to remind this person I'm a mandatory reporter, and if we go too far down a certain topic, I'm gonna do a suicide screener and we're gonna possibly call crisis counseling. And I think this is real work that I have to do for my own students. Yeah, it can be hard to figure out when you're just chatting and then when all of a sudden things start to slip. And I just try my best to walk that line. A lot of the counselors are very talented at this and are very adept at making that shift in a conversation, at giving kids those structured choices so they feel empowered and they feel cared about, but we're still calling parents. So that's I wish we'd written that a little bit better. And, yeah, so thanks for pointing that out. And I think we might, it might be a good idea for us to edit that before we, because it is really important to be clear about that. I will say that all of your counselors and folks who are doing this work are very clear about this. This is part of their professional training. It's part of their, the expectations of their profession.
Yeah, I guess just as a layman, when I read that, like not being, trained, well, I mean, I guess I was to an extent from law enforcement and security, but just reading that and not being a counselor or, a psychiatrist or a psychologist, I'm like, ooh, it made me feel, just to be honest with you, when I read it, I'm like, oh, well, that's making me say like, hey, just be careful so you know. And then what if they don't disclose? And then they go home and they hurt themselves. So that's what my thought process was with that statement. And I don't know who else might read that that's not in the profession that does clearly understand it.
So I appreciate he's taking notes, which I like. So another thing to be aware of is that, when school counselors and school mental health staff are perceived as breaking confidentiality like all of the time and without this sort of supportive, collaborative way of doing it, it does shut down kids' willingness to talk to them. And that is something that we did see in some school buildings. So we do need to be concerned about doing this in a supportive and collaborative way. I think but it's really interesting. Like, it really is about how you talk to kids and how you, especially with teenagers, you have to be like really respectful because they are at like their developmental stages. They are trying to become independent adults. And we know that they still have a ways to go. But if we tell them that, we're going to be crushing them when we want to be lifting them up and encouraging them forward towards that next stage of like early adulthood where they continue to pursue and develop their independence. So we have to do this with a lot of care and concern. And I do think it's important to make sure that our mental health staff are aware that collaboration and not being punitive, not shutting down conversations, but also being true and honoring, the reality of what it means to work in schools, which does mean disclosing things to parents. Thanks for pointing that out. I really appreciate that.
A few things. One, the transportation, we do have that, but it takes forever to get anywhere. That has to be noted. And then like if you live in Clifton, you have to go across a highway and then move around and finally get to the station place, get that, go someplace else, wait again, and you may wait for another hour before you get there. So that
I see.
it isn't the best method of being able to get somewhere. You're going to take you could take like half a day just to go see a therapist and then come back.
Okay.
The parts that I saw was when we look at secondary trauma, where's the teachers going to go for secondary trauma, where they're going to go to get help? Because I don't see counselors principals, vice principals, being able to handle that secondary trauma that teacher may have went through. And you can't tell the teacher, well, wait till after school and then you go. Because they might have heard something really horrifying and they need help then. So that's a concern of mine. The other part is in Mesa County, we have very few, and I mean, like, I don't even know if we have one, a therapist that speaks another language besides English. So there's an issue there. Then we have a problem with therapists doing therapy that is not culturally proficient with working with a family. So that's an issue. So where do families go then? Where they're going to go if, okay, you don't speak the language, or you don't know my culture, so you may say something that's not a good way to do that. So we have that. There's in here, doesn't talk about historical trauma that our kids go through, that they may see something or read something and get that trauma, and then how do teachers recognize that, and then how do they handle that trauma there? So I think there's those layers that when you're doing training that you have to do. And then my concern is training for teachers. When will they have time? Time I'm really concerned about is then if they're going to have to go to training, is the principals willing to quit having so many meetings with them so that they can actually go to training and still do the work that they need to do? So those are barriers that I see that doing that. I like the idea. I just don't know how that's going to get all done. I like to see it get done. But I do know, as I've seen people that were, when I was a parole officer, go through secondary trauma, and they can't be like most law enforcement. We just eat it and it just goes away. You know, it doesn't ever go away, but we just take it. Teachers aren't that way. And so how are they going to deal with that? I see a lot of harm coming. So
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that.
Those are all wonderful and very important points. And, just to validate a lot of what you said, like within suicide prevention and mental health work, we're definitely recognizing the deep need for therapists that can work in other languages other than English, as well as being doing culturally relevant care. I mean, it's just absolutely fundamental. I was just telling Seth this evening that we needed to do a literature review about telehealth, because that is a big emerging field. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I see my therapist through telehealth, and it works great for me, but it would be interesting to actually review the literature of how effective that is, because especially for our more rural communities, it's really important to, like where I live as well, there are Spanish speakers, and I work with some of them in my home community, and it is a very big concern. Like, how do we help get mental health resources that work for them, that are accessible, and that honor their own traditions and experiences. So that's really important to think about. It's very hard because these are big structural problems that many communities around the United States are experiencing. So I just kind of can't help but kind of hope that telehealth might help us get there. And so I do think we'll be doing a review looking into that. And I'm always happy to share information back when I gather it to see how effective that is and whether that's a possible solution we could think about. I will share, I'm also deeply concerned about our school staff. I'm very aware, I've said this to like many people over the course of this week, that I could basically never get to a school before the school counselors got there. And I had to leave before they left. They would be there before 7, and by like 4:30, I was like, I gotta go. I'm so tired. How are you still going? So these people are very inspiring, but I'm concerned about their own longevity and burnout and so on and so forth. I can also share with you that our school counselors are often supporting school staff in the building, not just with problem solving, but actually with staff's own emotional well-being. I saw that time and time again, and it's like both beautiful, but it's also kind of expanding their professional role. And that's difficult. So I don't know, you're raising really good points, and that's, I think, also why this has to be like an all-hands-on-deck situation.
I also like the part that you talked about how schools have to be welcoming.
Yeah.
What I see when I walk through schools forever, they're not welcoming culturally. There'll be like a nice couch, flowers, all that, but culturally, it isn't there. You don't see anything regarding marginalized groups. You don't see anything about people that are handicapped, those type of things. And I think if you're going to have a school that's going to be welcoming, it should be welcoming and show everything of the whole community, should show part of that community. And I don't think within our school district, when I walk through schools, I do not see that.
Yeah.
And that's something that we have to sort of change.
Absolutely. I'll just share one experience I had this morning because I stopped and took a picture of it. And it was, these I Matter campaigns. And it was just really beautiful because there was one in English and one in Spanish, like very prominently placed in a school, in a counseling office in a school building that does have a lot of Spanish-speaking families as well as Spanish-speaking kids. And you're right, like it struck me and it was beautiful. And it's relatively easy to do. It's a relatively easy way to communicate, you matter. We're communicating with you in your language. Also, secretaries, being able to connect with all kinds of families that walk into the school building. I'll tell you, secretaries, I've always had a deep respect for secretaries, but after watching how they support our kids and the families in these buildings, they are really powerful individuals within these school buildings. And, in one school, where I spent a lot of time, two of the people who answered the phones were fluent in both English and Spanish, and those were the two languages that dominated in the school. And it was just so nice to see that when someone called or walked in the front door, they would always start in English, but the second Spanish came out of the person's mouth, they just switched to Spanish, and it was so seamless. And I know that that's not possible in all school buildings, but I'm telling you, you guys have some schools that are doing the work and doing it really well. And that gives me a lot of hope, right? We have models out there in this district that can help guide us towards better ways to make all families feel included. And in fact, actually, their survey data was way better than other schools, including schools that had really high rates of Spanish-speaking families and students, but that didn't have that same, depth of people who speak Spanish in the school building. Yeah, absolutely.
So both Director Evanson and Director Chavez both brought up points that I had brought up concerns, but you meant two things. You mentioned that the MTSS was kind of executed differently in the schools, and not that we need to name any of that here, but do you have that information that you can provide to the district so we know which schools we might need to support more deeply, so we have continuity with what we need to do when it comes to the multi-tier, systems and supports? You guys have those notes as far as okay.
Yeah, we do. I'll also say that some of those schools have actually made really impressive changes just since last year, which was amazing to see when we went back and shared out our findings and then heard some of the changes that they made. So that's really, really cool. And one school that I was observing in for 2 years, just over the course of 1 year, they caught on to what a different building was doing, and they revolutionized their MTSS, and it was a great thing. I think the only thing, just to return to what Director Chavez said, is just that finding time and making sure we protect time for that collaborative problem solving for students in school buildings. We've collected our own data, as well as we actually wrote some survey questions that then got integrated into the Teaching and Learning Context of Colorado survey, the TLCC. And we can actually see in some of our schools that have really strong MTSS systems that serve kids' social and emotional needs as well as their academic needs, it actually helps teachers do their work better. That's how teachers feel. They're like, it's more work, but it actually helps me achieve my goals in the classroom, and I feel like our students are better supported. So there can be this time investment into MTSS within the school day, and I know how, time is the ultimate gold, right, in in our school system. But I do think the investment is worth it, though I also just recognize that there are just certain barriers that can be really hard to move around.
And I would add to that we heard from several schools when we were here that early release on Friday that used to be in place, that was a time where they were running these MTSS. So one of the things that we've found is that when there's a single MTSS team, they're processing 1,300, 1,400 kids in the high schools. So when they break down into smaller teams, so each counselor has an alphabet, they're maximizing more staff and they're really doing this collaborative work. But now they don't have that early release, and so they've lost some of that time. So then the question is, well, do they make people come at 7 a.m.? But then there's these other meetings, ILTs, OLTs that are happening at that time. And so I don't know how all of that works. And, but it's just one of the things that we heard while we were here, both in the past and then, of course, when we were delivering the report in the last couple of days.
Just to clarify, I think it was that they were hoping they would get early release, but they didn't have it, but that there was also a change in the amount of planning hours that teachers get. I think that was
Yeah, we were trying.
We got a deluge of updates this week, so.
A lot has changed, even I think since you guys had started this, so that's great to hear. And I think part of it, we are a large system. We are the largest employer in Mesa County. And so we do have a lot of moving parts, and I think the staff is doing a really good job of trying to get more continuity just across the board. And like you said, schools leaning on other schools that are doing it really well, and they don't necessarily have to recreate the wheel, but they can just say, hey, how are you doing this? And so I see that across the board in a lot of different departments. The other question I have, so as I started reading this, I think one thing that really came out to me, and I'm glad you brought it up, was the faith communities, because I know for kids, even though they spend a majority of their time at school, there's always that, well, what do I do when I'm not at school? And then you have those additional supports of sometimes other peers who you don't go to school with, right? And so it kind of changes things up for them. I know that was really important to me growing up. So my question is, when we're talking about working with the community, is it them working in their own silo, or are we trying to bring, and this might be more of a question for Jen and her team, but are we working with bringing the faith community in if a child or a family has a faith community, like let's say they have a youth pastor or something, but then do they then work with the counselors? And I know obviously there's probably confidentiality there, but if the student and the family wanted that, it seems like if we got everybody on the same page versus, well, only the youth pastor knows about it, or only the counselor knows about it, or different things like that, now all of a sudden we have a full wraparound of supports around a student. And maybe it's not even a faith community, maybe it's just another social club or something that the kids do. I know faith communities are important. I think the church I attend actually has done some of the soul, what's it called? Anyways, yes, the soul shop, thank you. Because they do see that, and a lot of times kids will come and speak to them about it. So I guess in a long-winded way are we looking at ways where we're not just operating in each of our individual silos, but we're really trying to work collaboratively as a community, coming around these families and these students?
I love that question. I'll say first of all that in my opinion, and based on research, the more information we can have flowing between different people who care about these kids and are engaged in supporting these kids, the better. Of course, at that point, it really is the parents have a lot of power or the legal guardians to decide what gets shared about their child. And I would probably also defer, I'm always very quick to defer on certain issues to the lawyers, right? Because they're the ones who really understand the nuance of confidentiality. But I don't, yes, it's a great idea to share as much information as families feel comfortable. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so I should probably be careful, but I think that's something that's like worth exploring, whether there are ways in which you can have information shared. I mean, pediatricians can share information with the school, and that can be tremendously powerful for supporting families and counselors and kids, right? The same thing between if a kid has been hospitalized, it's incredibly important to have ways to make sure that that information gets back to the school. But again, the parents have a right to control that information about their child. And sometimes that can be frustrating. I not necessarily in this community, but I have worked. We did work in several other communities, but I'm thinking of Poplar Grove, where we were working on suicide loss more than suicide prevention. And it was just really heartbreaking sometimes when the information wasn't shared, and so supports were not wrapped around a kid who really needed that care.
Yeah. I just wonder if, and I'm sure we're doing this, just as if a student is confiding in, a staff we have at, the district or a counselor, and then the parents are brought in, then there's an encouragement to the parents to just say, what other communities are you a part of? And, and then just, sometimes you have to give people sort of the idea or their permission to say, because I could only imagine as a parent, and I've dealt with different things with my own children, sometimes when you're in the midst of it, when the emotion is high, you're not thinking very clearly about what next steps I need to take, right? And so, because you're a little bit in survival mode, because you're afraid. And so I think sometimes if we just remind parents, hey, if you have this other community, you might want to share with them, or encourage the student, because I know, again, having teenagers of my own, as much as sometimes I like to just lay down the law, the other time they do want to be collaborated with. They want to have a conversation, and so telling them to say this is yours to share, and I would really encourage you to share this with so and so. I just wonder if there's a way we can just kind of encourage parents to maybe that they could go and then tell other people in their communities so that those kids can be wrapped around. Because I know that's been a huge help to me, because we all know with kids that you can tell them something many times, but once it's someone else outside of mom or dad or whoever's raising them, then they think it's the best idea. So, and again, it's just, and we are a great community here, and I know that we all like to work together, and so I think I could see a lot of people wanting to come together on this. So and that answers it. I just wanted to make sure we weren't working too much in silos, but that we were trying to really work together as a community. And I know Jen and our, Mesa County and many others are working on trying to bring all of those people to the table so that we can do that.
Yeah, I fully support that.
Any other questions? Well, great. Thank you for the information, and thank you for the work that you did on this. It's really great. So appreciate your time and for you guys being here. So.
Well, we really appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you. Thank you very much for making the time. And I know there was a little bit of accommodating our schedule so that we could be here in person.
It worked out.
So we're really grateful.
And the only thing I want to add is just, you said at the beginning, it's a conversation. And so I think that's, we have some of our staff here that have been in conversation this whole time with Dr. Mueller and her team. And so we'll continue to do that as well. I know Dan and his team have a whole plan for how they're going to try and take the information from this report and put things into action. So we do appreciate years of work that y'all have done in our community and how you're partnering with our staff. So we appreciate that.
And one of the things that we do is when we work with a community, we never go away. We are just basically, Seth keeps saying, until we die, we're pro bono consult, or he says, until we lose our minds, which I was like, like if we become senile, well, then we may be of no use. But actually, we're always available for anything you need. I mean, I've had principals on a day of a suicide loss reach out to me and ask me to be on call to review everything that they're sending out, any idiosyncratic, weird decisions they have to make. I've had folks in this community as well as other communities just ask me, can you tell me what the state of the literature is on this thing? And we do it. So that's, the investment, the gift that you guys gave us, gave the school staff, but also schools around the United States is really profound, and we're incredibly grateful not only to have been able to spend time in this incredibly beautiful place, but also to have had this opportunity to learn so much. So we take that really seriously and are deeply appreciative for the opportunity.
All right, board. We have time for some open board discussion. If any, I know.
Jones is like,
Yeah. Well,
I didn't have anything. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's just me. Didn't have nothing.
The one thing I think we might need to come back and talk about this, and maybe with, I think we have some shorter work sessions coming up, I'm not sure. But once George puts some of this work together, because Jose Luis was just talking about kind of goals, you know. So I think once maybe we, and I think George encouraged us to talk about the norms and the goals. You know, I think I was the one who said I want to be nationally the best. I was shooting big. I was like, let's just shoot for the stars. Yeah, right. Let's big. So, you know, so just maybe different things that maybe we each individually want to share about something that we would like to see, goals that we have. I don't know if you guys want to share something now, or if you want to wait till we have some of the stuff back from George and we can talk about it at like a work session. Have it all back in a nice packet? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
Well, it struck me as I was writing notes off to the left of your agendas. It has a board purpose, essential board roles, and board's core driving values. I don't know when those were created. It was prior to even, I mean, I think they've been the same ones since forever, so it would be kind of, I mean, I realize that's small, but what's on our website is this stuff. It's old, so we could have it all updated and pretty clear with what y'all come up with. We can start putting that out to the community around.
Yeah, because I think like we could change, like we could put our norms on there, just maybe kind of make some more things a little bit more succinct. So, yeah, and even a couple of us can kind of work on some of that and then get it back to the board to bring back. So I know, and we didn't have to share some sort of incredibly embarrassing fact about ourselves or something like we had to do last time, which, so you two got off, but we might still have to have you tell us something that, and just made it up. I know. I was trying to, well, I thought Alex was gonna do an icebreaker thing, so I was walking in trying to think about like, oh gosh, what's something I gotta say? Yeah, so. All right, well, thank you, everybody, for your time this evening. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Dr. Hill, for being here. And that was a robust amount of information, but it was really good. So thank you, gentlemen, for your security. So thank you, Angela, for the enchiladas.